What you are about to hear will shake everything you thought you knew about the times we live in. This testimony comes from someone who never imagined becoming a messenger of divine revelation. Drive. Rachel Cohen, a renowned professor at one of America's most prestigious universities, was fighting the battle of her life against aggressive cancer when something extraordinary happened. On July 9, she was declared clinically dead for 14 minutes. What she experienced in those moments was not just a glimpse behind the veil, but a direct encounter with Jesus Christ himself, who revealed to her 5 catastrophic events that will soon shock the world. This is not just another near-death story, it is an urgent and prophetic warning that demands your immediate attention. If you are watching this video, it is no coincidence. Stay with us until the end, because what Drive Cohen witnessed will change your perspective of the world and prepare you for what is to come. Before we begin, we ask that you subscribe to our channel and leave a comment so we know where you're watching. Your support helps us share these crucial messages with those who desperately need them. My name is Drive Rachel Cohen, and I have dedicated the last 20 years of my life to academia, teaching comparative religion at Columbia University. I have always been a woman of data, research, and scientific analysis. My Jewish heritage instilled in me a deep appreciation for spiritual matters, but I approached them from an intellectual perspective. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine sharing a testimony like this. It all began in April 2025 when I received news that would shatter my carefully curated world. After months of unexplained fatigue and persistent pain, the doctors delivered their verdict: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. They gave me 3 to 6 months to live. As someone who had dedicated my career to studying different religious perspectives on suffering and mortality, I came face to face with my own existence. The following weeks were a whirlwind of treatments, consultations, and the overwhelming weight of knowing my time was running out. Despite my academic understanding of various religious traditions, I felt spiritually empty. I had knowledge of God, but I didn't truly know him. This was about to change drastically. July 9th began like any other day in my fight against cancer. I was at Mount Sinai Hospital for what was supposed to be a chemotherapy session, routine. The medical team was preparing my 4-drip when something went terribly wrong. My body began to react violently to the treatment. Alarms started blaring. The nurses rushed in, and I could hear the urgency in their voices as they worked frantically to stabilize me. The pain was excruciating at first, but then it began to subside. I felt myself lighten, as if lifted from my physical body. The hospital room receded, and I found myself in an indescribable space. It wasn't darkness, but it wasn't earthly light either. It was something beyond both, a realm where the very atmosphere seemed to pulse with life and purpose. Then I saw him. Jesus Christ stood before me, not as the figure I had studied in ancient texts or seen depicted in religious art, but as a living, breathing presence whose being radiated love and authority. His eyes held a depth I never imagined possible, and when he looked at me, I felt completely known and completely loved at the same time. Rachel said, her voice echoing in every part of my being, I have brought you here because time is short and my people need to know what is coming. You have studied many religions, but today you will find the truth that transforms everything. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to process what was happening through my educational background, but I felt overwhelmed by his presence. This was not a subject to study or analyze. This was the living God, and I was in his presence. I will show you 5 events that will happen very soon. Jesus continued, they are not possibilities or probabilities, they are certainties. The world is about to experience a shaking on a scale never seen before, and my people must be prepared. As he spoke, the space around us transformed. We were no longer in that ethereal realm, but in what seemed like a vast viewing area where scenes from the future began to unfold before us like living movies. The clarity was astonishing. Every detail was sharp, every sound clear, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was witnessing real future events. The first catastrophe, Jesus said, his voice conveying authority and deep concern. It will seem like a natural disaster, but it will trigger a chain reaction that will transform the world economy and test the faith of many. The scene before us materialized with astonishing clarity. I saw the west coast of the United States, concentrating on California. What I witnessed next was terrifying and indescribable. A massive earthquake, far more powerful than any recorded in history, struck the San Andreas fault system, but this was no simple quake. The earthquake triggered a domino effect that seemed almost supernatural in its pace and impact. I saw great cities collapse. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego were devastated in a matter of minutes. The infrastructure on which millions depended simply crumbled, roads tore like ribbons, skyscrapers swayed and fell, and the earth itself seemed to rebel against everything built upon it. But in other areas, the rupture led to chaos. People who had never learned to resolve conflicts without hiding behind screens found themselves unable to cooperate. Tensions brewing in online echo chambers exploded into real-world violence. The anonymity and distance provided by digital communication had prevented many from developing authentic conflict resolution skills. The church will face a unique test in this time, Jesus continued. I saw the scene centered on several faith communities. Congregations that had forged authentic relationships thrived. Those that relied primarily on digital ministry struggled to maintain connection with their people. I saw churches that had invested in personal discipleship and in-person fellowship become havens of stability and hope. They now knew how to meet without technology, how to care for one another through direct action, and how to maintain the faith without constant digital reinforcement. In contrast, churches that had built their entire ministry model around online services and digital interaction experienced a decline. Without their streaming capabilities, social media presence, and sophisticated technological infrastructure, many found themselves without a true community to lean on. This instability separated authentic relationships from digital performance. Jesus said, "Many who appear to have many followers will find themselves truly alone. But those who have quietly invested in genuine love and service will find themselves surrounded by a true family." The government response was chaotic, largely ineffective. Officials who had become dependent on digital communication and data analysis found themselves unable to coordinate relief efforts. The centralized systems on which modern governments relied proved to be fatal weaknesses when they failed. I observed how local communities that had maintained some independence from digital infrastructure fared much better than those that relied entirely on technology. Rural areas, with a strong tradition of good neighborliness, adapted more quickly than urban centers, where people often did not know their neighbors' names. This catastrophe will last for months, not days. Jesus warned that failing systems will not be restored quickly. Humanity will be forced to rediscover what it means to live in authentic community. As the vision continued, I saw how this digital collapse affected different aspects of society. Education systems ground to a halt as students and teachers discovered they had no way to connect without their platforms. Healthcare was impacted by the inaccessibility of medical records and the disappearance of telemedicine. Even basic services like emergency response were compromised due to dispatch system failures. But in the midst of this chaos, I witnessed something beautiful. I saw what Jesus called the remnant community emerge. These were people who had maintained some independence from digital dependence and who offered to serve others during the crisis. They organized food distributions, provided medical assistance, and offered shelter to those in need. "These are my people," Jesus said, his voice filled with pride and love. They weren't fooled by the illusion of digital connection. They understand that true community requires sacrifice, presence, and genuine love. The scene showed me how this catastrophe would interact with the first. The California earthquake had already exhausted the country's resources and infrastructure. Now, with the failure of digital systems, recovery efforts became exponentially more difficult. The combination of physical destruction and technological collapse created a perfect storm that overwhelmed existing emergency response capabilities. Notice how each catastrophe builds on the one before it, Jesus explained. This is no coincidence. These events are orchestrated to strip people of the false securities that have kept them from seeking me. When all crutches are removed, they will either turn to me or fall into despair. I saw how diverse groups responded to the crisis in different ways. Some communities came together in remarkable displays of cooperation and mutual aid. Others fell into mistrust and conflict. The difference Jesus showed me often depended on whether those communities contained mature believers who could exemplify genuine love and service. The second catastrophe will reveal who has built their identity on digital performance and who has rooted their identity in me. Jesus continued, "Many who appear strong online will crumble when their platforms disappear, but those who have walked with me in secret will shine like stars in the darkness." As this vision faded, I felt the weight of understanding about me. It wasn't just the failure of technology, but humanity forced to confront what true relationships and community truly require. The digital age had created an illusion of connection while fostering unprecedented isolation. Now that illusion was fading, the third catastrophe will test them in another way, Jesus said in a voice that carried a note of warning and hope. But remember, Rachel, each of these events fulfills my purposes. I am not destroying, I am revealing. I am not punishing, I am preparing. Those who have ears to hear will understand and draw near to me. I braced myself as Jesus prepared to reveal the third catastrophe. The weight of what I had already witnessed weighed on my spirit, but I knew I had to see everything he wanted to show me. The scene materialized before us with stunning clarity. I found myself gazing at the farmland in America's heartland, the breadbasket that had fed not only the nation, but much of the world, for generations. But something was terribly wrong. Crops were dying, not from drought or flooding, but from something far more sinister. I watched as vast fields of corn, wheat, and soybeans began to wither and rot from the inside out. The plants looked healthy on the surface, but their roots were being destroyed by what appeared to be rapidly spreading pollution. "This isn't natural," Jesus explained, his voice filled with righteous anger. "What you are witnessing is the result of years of poisoning the earth in the name of progress. The soil itself has become toxic and will now reject what has been planted in it." I watched in horror as Midwestern farmers discovered their crops were simultaneously failing. These were not isolated incidents, but a coordinated collapse that seemed to affect the most productive agricultural regions. The contamination spread like wildfire through groundwater systems and soil networks connecting farms thousands of miles away. The initial response was confusion and denial. Agricultural experts rushed to explain what was happening, but their conventional solutions proved useless. Chemical treatments that had worked for decades now seemed to accelerate harvest failures. "Look how your solutions become their problems," Jesus observed. "They treated the earth as their possession to exploit, rather than my creation to manage. Now the earth itself is rebelling against their artificial interventions." Within weeks, the scale of the disaster became clear. The United States, which had been the world's largest food exporter, suddenly could no longer feed its own population. The domino effect spread globally, as nations that relied on American agricultural exports were faced with severe shortages. I saw supermarkets with empty shelves, not because of panic buying, but because there simply wasn't enough food to replenish them. Prices for basic commodities skyrocketed overnight. Families who had never worried about their next meal found themselves standing in lines that stretched for blocks. But physical hunger was only part of the catastrophe. I saw the social order begin to unravel in ways that made previous disasters seem manageable. When people can't feed their children, civilized behavior disappears. Riots quickly erupted in major cities, looting became common. The thin veneer of social cooperation that had held communities together evaporated under the pressure of genuine scarcity. "This catastrophe will reveal the true nature of the human heart," Jesus said, his voice heavy with pain. "Some will share their last morsel with strangers, others will steal from their neighbors. The same pressure that creates saints also creates monsters." The government's response was chaotic and largely ineffective. Officials, who had never dealt with real shortages, lacked a framework for managing widespread hunger. Emergency food distribution systems, already overburdened by previous disasters, collapsed under the overwhelming demand. The National Guard was deployed to maintain order, but even they struggled to function while their own families went hungry. I saw how different communities responded radically differently. Some neighborhoods came together in remarkable displays of mutual aid and sharing resources. Community gardens sprang up overnight. People with minimal agricultural knowledge became invaluable community leaders. Skills that had been forgotten in the era of industrial agriculture suddenly became essential for survival. But in other areas, the collapse led to violence and chaos. People who had never learned to cooperate without external authority found themselves unable to organize effective responses. The individualistic culture that had dominated American society for decades proved to be a fatal weakness when collective action became necessary for survival. "Notice how my people respond differently," Jesus said, directing my attention to specific communities. "Those who have learned to trust in me, rather than relying on their own provision, will find ways to thrive even in scarcity." I saw churches and faith communities that had quietly prepared for difficult times. They became pillars of stability for their neighborhoods. They weren't resource-hoarding survivalist groups, but communities that had learned to live simply and share generously. They had maintained ties with local farmers and preserved traditional food preservation techniques. Most importantly, they had cultivated the spiritual maturity to remain generous, even when resources were scarce. This catastrophe will separate those who trust in their own abundance from those who trust in my provision, Jesus explained. Many who seem generous when they had abundance will become selfish when faced with real need, but those who have learned to depend on me will discover that I can multiply even the smallest portion. The scene shifted to show me how this food crisis interacted with previous catastrophes. The California earthquake had already disrupted supply chains and damaged agricultural infrastructure. The cyber attack had made it impossible to coordinate relief efforts or maintain the complex logistics required for modern food distribution. Now, with crops themselves failing, the perfect storm of scarcity had unfolded. I watched as international tensions rapidly escalated. Countries that had been allies began to compete fiercely for the remaining food exports. Trade wars erupted. Some nations imposed total bans on the export of agricultural products, prioritizing that their own populations were under pressure to international obligations. The global cooperation that had defined the modern world began to fragment under the pressure of survival. This shaking will reveal which nations have built their strength on their own resources and which have placed their trust in me, Jesus said. Those who have honored me will find an unexpected supply. Those who have rejected me will discover that their riches cannot satisfy the hungry souls. But in the midst of this chaos, I witnessed something that filled me with hope. I saw the emergence of what Jesus called the multiplying communities. These were groups of believers who had learned to live by faith, not by sight. When they shared their meager resources, they somehow always had plenty left over. When they planted seeds in supposedly contaminated land, their crops grew healthy and strong. "These are my people who live according to the principles of the kingdom," Jesus said, his voice full of love and pride. "They understand that my economy works differently than the world's. In my kingdom, giving leads to receiving, and sharing leads to abundance." I saw how these communities became magnets for desperate people searching for hope. Non-believers who had mocked faith in times of plenty were drawn to groups that somehow maintained joy and generosity in the midst of scarcity. The witness of believers who trusted in God's provision, even in the face of real hardship, proved more powerful than any sermon or evangelistic program. The third catastrophe will create the greatest evangelistic opportunity in generations, Jesus explained. When people shed their false securities, they will open themselves to spiritual truth like never before. Many who had hardened their hearts against the gospel will be softened by witnessing the gospel in action. The scene demonstrated how this crisis would affect different aspects of society. Educational institutions struggled to maintain their programs when students couldn't concentrate due to hunger. Health systems were overwhelmed by malnutrition-related diseases. Even services basic government services became difficult to maintain when civil servants couldn't afford to go to work, but I also witnessed the emergence of new forms of community organization. Neighborhood councils were formed to coordinate resource sharing. Skill-sharing networks emerged where people taught each other forgotten arts such as food preservation, basic farming, and home remedies. The crisis forced people to rediscover community on a human scale, something that had been lost in the age of global trade. This catastrophe will reveal those who have built their security on material abundance and those who have rooted their peace in me, Jesus said. Those who have learned to be content in any circumstance will find the strength to help others. Those who have based their identity on their possessions will despair when they fail to provide what they truly need. The scene began to change as Jesus prepared to show me the fourth catastrophe, but before the vision changed completely, he gave me a specific message about the food crisis. "Tell my people not to fear this earthquake," he said in a voice full of authority and tenderness. "Those who trust in me will lack nothing they truly need." I fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. I provided manna in the desert. I am still the same God who can multiply the smallest offering into abundant provision. As the third vision faded, I felt the weight of understanding take hold deeper in my spirit. This wasn't just about food shortages. It was about humanity forced to confront the difference between wants and needs, between security and trust, between hoarding and sharing. The crisis would reveal the true condition of the human heart and separate those who trusted in their own provision from those who trusted in God's faithfulness. "The fourth catastrophe will test you in unimaginable ways," Jesus said, his voice carrying a note of warning and hope. "But remember this, Rachel, each of these events serves to draw hearts to me. I am not destroying, I am revealing. I am not punishing, I am preparing. Those with ears to hear will understand and draw near to me in every trial." Jesus looked at me, and his eyes, which had once been full of compassion, now shone with a seriousness that made me tremble. "The fourth catastrophe," he said, "would affect not only human systems but also the illusion of peace that humanity had built for itself." The landscape changed rapidly. I saw the world's capitals no longer as centers of negotiation and diplomacy, but as hotbeds of recrimination and suspicion. International alliances that had seemed unbreakable began to crumble. The global food crisis had exacerbated divisions, with each nation blaming the others for the shortages and chaos. I witnessed sudden regime changes in key countries, not due to popular revolutions, but to coups orchestrated by dark forces operating in the background. These new, aggressive, nationalist leaders renounced treaties and international collaborations. Borders were militarized, and highways were closed, ports to trade. Belligerent rhetoric dominated the news, fueling fear and xenophobia. What followed was not an open and simultaneous world war, but a series of unexpected and brutal regional conflicts that erupted in unpredictable places. Sea and land supply lines were disrupted, not only of food, but of all vital resources. Energy supplies became a weapon, and nations cut off supplies to others, causing grid collapses in entire regions. This, in turn, made recovery from previous catastrophes even more difficult. I saw how lack of trust and desperation drove nations to reckless acts. The use of weapons, both conventional and unconventional, was threatened and sometimes used. The shadow of a larger conflict loomed over the entire planet, but Jesus told me that this crisis also revealed the true nature of human power, fleeting and corrupt. Even in this chaos, the remnant community acted as a bridge of peace. Believers, regardless of their nationalities, united to help those suffering, overcoming the barriers imposed by governments and demonstrating the love of Christ that knows no boundaries. They did not ally themselves with any earthly faction, but served humanity, earning the respect and trust of many. This catastrophe, Jesus told me, would separate those who trusted in the power and might of arms from those who trusted in his sovereignty. As the horror of conflict and global chaos faded, Jesus drew closer. His voice was softer, but his words were as sharp as a sword, yet laden with infinite promise. "The fifth and final catastrophe before my return," he said, his eyes piercing my soul with love and truth, will not be a physical event, but a global spiritual schism. Humanity will be forced to choose, and there will no longer be neutrality. I saw the world divided into two distinct camps, not by borders or wealth, but by the deepest orientation of the soul. On one side were those who, after seeing all earthly security, money, social structures, even peace between nations crumble, turned to God with profound humility and repentance. They had understood the futility of ephemeral things and now sought the only true source of salvation. These people, often the humblest and those who had suffered the most, found an unexpected faith and a peace that surpassed all understanding. The remnant community not only grew exponentially, but radiated love, hope, and inexplicable joy. They understood that true salvation is not limited to physical disasters, but to the eternal salvation of the soul, a gift from God to all who believe. Jesus showed me that salvation was not complex. Tell them, he said with infinite sweetness, that the path is narrow, but clear. Whoever confesses with their mouth that I am the Lord and believes in their heart that God raised me from the dead, will be saved. There is no ritual or work they can do to earn it, only humble faith and trust in my sacrifice. My grace is sufficient for all who turn to me. On the other hand, there were those who grew even more hardened, blinded by anger, despair, and denial. They rejected any idea of divine intervention or spiritual salvation. Many turned to false ideologies or charismatic leaders who promised impossible earthly solutions or simply violence and chaos. Hatred and division intensified within these factions, leading to internal conflict and a complete disintegration of the fabric. Social. There was no longer room for half measures. Every heart was forced to reveal its true allegiance. These were those who, despite seeing the signs and the collapses, chose to cling to the darkness, rejecting the light and hope offered to them. Jesus showed me that this schism would be painful, separating families and friends, but necessary. My spirit, he said, will breathe throughout the world, revealing truth and falsehood. Those who thirst for righteousness will find me and will be purified by the fire of these trials. Those who prefer darkness will be consumed by their own bitterness. This was not an arbitrary punishment, but a final revelation, an opportunity for humanity to choose eternal life or spiritual death. For those who remain steadfast in faith, eternal salvation is assured. My return is very soon.